he said, it with such casual cruelty. My son-in-law, Mark. His voice a dismissive flick of the wrist as if shooing away an errant fly. You're lucky we even let you stay here, old woman. This is our house now. Our farm. You're just baggage. Baggage. Me, Evelyn Hayes, 68 years old. A woman who had poured her life, her sweat, her very soul into this land, this farm, alongside my beloved Thomas for 45 of those years. This wasn't just soil and timber, it was the repository of my memories, the cradle of my family, the place where my heart and Thomas's were inextricably intertwined. And now, in the eyes of this arrogant upstart, this man my own daughter, Clara, had chosen to marry, I was reduced to mere baggage, an inconvenience to be tolerated, a relic of a past they were eager to bulldoze and reinvent in their own glossy, self-serving image. Clara, my Clara, stood beside him, her gaze fixed on some indeterminate point beyond my shoulder, her silence a damning complicity. They thought my quiet endurance, my pained acceptance of their escalating encroachments on my life, my home, was a sign of my fading faculties, my meek surrender to their youthful aggressive ambition. They didn't know that his words, those 7 little words, "You're lucky we even let you stay," had not broken me but had instead ignited a spark, a cold, hard flame of resolve in the deepest, most dormant corner of my heart. They didn't know that while they were planning their next modernization of my farm, financed, I suspected by my dwindling savings, I was quietly, meticulously, planning my own kind of renovation, a complete and utter demolition of their entitled assumptions. I didn't storm out. I didn't raise my voice. I simply left, quietly, with a small worn suitcase and a heart full of a grief so profound it felt like a physical ache, but also a strange, unexpected lightness. And as I walked down that long farm driveway, the gravel crunching under my sensible shoes, I made a silent vow. They might think they had won, they might think they had successfully relegated me to the scrap heap of their ambitious lives, but they had forgotten one crucial detail. The farm, the land, the very foundation upon which their arrogant dreams were built, was still half mine, legally, irrevocably. And I, Evelyn Hayes, the baggage, the old woman, was about to sell my half, and in doing so, I would sell their comfortable, unearned, and utterly undeserved world right out from under them. This is how I learned that sometimes the quietest departures make the loudest statements, and how the greatest strength can be found in the deepest betrayal. Now let me tell you what really happened. How the pastoral dream Thomas and I had built became a nightmare of disrespect, and how one old woman, pushed too far, finally decided to reclaim not just her property, but her very soul. The farm hadn't always been a place of contention. For most of my life, it had been my sanctuary, my joy, my life's work. Thomas and I had bought it as newlyweds, a sprawling, slightly dilapidated 100 acres in the rolling hills of Idaho, armed with more dreams than dollars, more determination than experience. We'd poured our youth into it, our laughter, our tears, our sweat. We'd coaxed life from the stubborn soil, mended fences under a blazing summer sun, brought in harvests against the threat of early snow. We'd raised Clara there, our only child, her childhood a sun-drenched idyll of chasing butterflies through wildflower meadows, of learning to ride the old, sway-backed mare, Starlight, of falling asleep to the gentle lowing of cattle in the field. Thomas, a man whose quiet strength was as steadfast as the ancient oaks that bordered our property, had loved this land with a fierce, protective passion. He understood its rhythms, its moods, its uncompromising demand, and he had taught me to love it too, not with the easy affection of a casual observer, but with the deep, abiding respect of a true partner in its stewardship. When Thomas passed, 5 years ago now, a sudden, unexpected heart attack, stealing him away on a crisp autumn morning much like this one, a part of me had died with him. The farm, once so vibrant, so filled with his presence, suddenly felt vast, empty, its silence amplifying my grief. Clara, then living in the city, a 2-hour drive away, had been solicitous, worried. "Mom," she'd said, her voice laced with a genuine, if somewhat anxious concern. You can't possibly manage this place on your own. It's too much for you. Mark and we've been talking. Maybe we should move back, help you out. Keep the farm in the family. Mark, her husband, a man I had never entirely warmed to. He was a city boy, a software salesman with smooth hands, a smoother tongue, and an almost pathological aversion to anything resembling physical labor or rural simplicity. He'd always treated the farm, during their infrequent weekend visits, with a kind of bemused condescension, as if it were a quaint, slightly backward theme park. The thought of him helping out on the farm was, frankly, laughable, but Clara had been insistent, and I, in my grief, my loneliness, my desperate yearning for family, for connection, had allowed myself to be persuaded. Perhaps, I'd thought, it would be a new beginning. Perhaps Mark would learn to appreciate the land, its beauty, its honesty. Perhaps Clara, back in the familiar embrace of her childhood home, would rediscover some of the warmth, the simple joy that seemed to have been leached out of her by her ambitious, city-centric life. How wrong I had been. They moved in not as partners, not as helpers, but as conquerors. Mark, with his spreadsheets and his business plans, immediately began talking about modernizing, optimizing my carefully tended organic vegetable garden, the one that had supplied our table, and half the neighborhood, with fresh produce for years, was deemed inefficient and earmarked for a new, state-of-the-art hydroponic greenhouse he'd read about in some glossy business magazine. Thomas's beloved workshop, filled with his handcrafted tools, his half-finished projects, the lingering scent of sawdust and memories, was to be converted into a home office for Mark, complete with ergonomic chairs and multiple computer screens. Clara, who had once loved to bake with me, her hands dusted with flour, her laughter echoing in our warm, cluttered kitchen, now spoke of streamlining meal prep and outsourcing domestic chores. My role, it soon became clear, was not that of a cherished mother, a respected partner in the farm's legacy. I was to be managed, tolerated, an increasingly irrelevant fixture in their new, improved, and utterly soulless version of my life. The co-ownership of the farm, a legal arrangement Thomas and I had put in place years ago to ensure Clara's future security, was now, I realized with a dawning sickening clarity, not a source of familial unity, but a weapon in their hands, a tool for my own gradual, insidious dispossession. They didn't need my permission, not really. As co-owner, Clara, and by extension Mark, had a legal right to make changes, to implement their vision, and my voice, my opinions, my 45 years of experience on this land, were increasingly pointedly ignored. I was the old guard, resistant to change, an obstacle to progress, or so they made me feel, with their polite, dismissive smiles, their hushed, impatient sighs, their carefully worded suggestions that perhaps I should rest more, not worry my head about these things, leave the difficult decisions to them. The farm, my farm, was being transformed before my very eyes, its soul, its history, its very essence, being systematically stripped away, replaced by something cold, efficient, and utterly alien. And I, its heart, its memory, was being relegated to the background, a silent, grieving spectator at the desecration of everything I held dear. The erosion of my place on the farm was a slow, insidious process, like a creeping frost that gradually numbs the senses before delivering its killing blow. Mark, with his boundless, and frankly baseless, self-confidence, took to his new role as farm manager, with an enthusiasm that was both alarming and deeply offensive. He knew nothing of farming, nothing of the land, nothing of the delicate balance of nature that Thomas had so intuitively understood. Yet he strode about the property, issuing pronounced barking orders at the few remaining hired hands, most of whom had worked for Thomas for years, and regarded Mark with a mixture of bewilderment and ill-concealed contempt. His city shoes, caked in an unfamiliar layer of mud, his tailored shirts increasingly stained with grease and something that looked suspiciously like cow manure. His modernizations were, almost without exception, disastrous. The state-of-the-art hydroponic greenhouse, purchased at exorbitant expense, using, I suspected, Funds borrowed from the farm's already dwindling operating account produced a crop of tasteless, watery tomatoes that even the pigs turned their noses up at. His attempt to optimize the dairy herd by introducing a new, scientifically formulated feed resulted in a dramatic drop in milk production and a herd of decidedly unhappy and distinctly gassy cows. My gentle suggestions, born of decades of practical experience, were met with a patronizing smile from Mark, a dismissive, "That's all very well, Evelyn, but we're in the 21st century now. We need to embrace new technologies, new methods." Clara, when I appealed to her, would just sigh, her eyes clouded with a familiar anxiety. "Mom, Mark knows what he's doing. He's read all the books. He's consulted with experts, as if 45 years of living and breathing this land counted for nothing." My home, the farmhouse itself, underwent a similar, unwelcome transformation. Clara, under Mark's influence, or perhaps, driven by her own long-suppressed desire to erase any trace of her provincial upbringing, embarked on a relentless campaign of decluttering and minimalizing. My cherished possessions, Thomas's books, my grandmother's china, the countless small, seemingly insignificant mementos that held the stories of our lives, were deemed dust collectors, old-fashioned, unnecessary. They were relegated to the attic, or worse, to a series of hastily labeled cardboard boxes in the damp, unwelcoming cellar. The warm, comfortable clutter of our life together was replaced by stark white walls, uncomfortable angular furniture, and a general air of sterile impersonal modernity. Even the kitchen, my sanctuary, the heart of our home, was not immune. My beloved, slightly battered, enamelware pots and pans were replaced by a gleaming professional-grade, stainless steel set that I found frankly intimidating. My collection of handwritten recipe cards, passed down through generations, was dismissed as unhygienic and inefficient, supplanted by a sleek tablet computer, displaying complicated, overly fussy recipes from celebrity chefs. I felt like a stranger in my own kitchen, my movements clumsy, uncertain, my culinary expertise, once a source of pride and pleasure, now rendered obsolete. My financial contributions, my modest pension, which I had willingly, naively, allowed them to manage, as part of the household budget, seemed to disappear into a black hole of their ever-increasing expenses. There were new cars, expensive clothes for Clara, endless gadgets for Mark, lavish weekend getaways to de-stress from the rigors of their farm management. When I'd tentatively inquire about the farm's finances, about the dwindling profits, Mark would become defensive, evasive, muttering about market fluctuations and unforeseen capital expenditures. Clara would simply change the subject, her discomfort palpable. I realized with a growing sense of unease, not just being emotionally marginalized, I was being financially exploited. But what could I do? The co-ownership agreement, drafted in a spirit of familial trust and unity, now felt like a legal straitjacket, binding me to their disastrous decisions, their reckless spending. My attempts to assert my rights, to question their management, were met with a united front of condescension and dismissal. "Mom, you just don't understand modern business practices," Mark would say, his tone pitying. "Don't worry your pretty little head about it, Evelyn. We've got it all under control." Got it all under control. Yes, they had control. Control of the farm, control of the finances, control of my life. And I, it seemed, was powerless to stop them. The loneliness was a constant, gnawing. My old friends, the women I had shared a lifetime with, rarely visited anymore. The atmosphere at the farm, once so warm and welcoming, had become strained, oppressed. Clara, caught between her loyalty to her husband and her increasingly tenuous connection to her mother, grew more distant, more withdrawn. Our conversations became superficial, stilted, devoid of any real warmth or intimacy. I missed Thomas with an intensity that was almost unbearable. I missed his quiet strength, his gentle humor, his unwavering, unconditional love. I missed our shared life, our shared dreams, the simple, profound contentment of our partnership. Now I was adrift, a solitary figure in a landscape that was becoming increasingly alien, increasingly hostile. The farm, my home, my legacy, was slipping through my fingers, and there seemed to be nothing I could do to stop it, except perhaps there was a small, defiant spark, the one that had flickered to life after the baggage comment, began to glow a little brighter, fueled by each fresh indignity, each new act of disrespect. I might be old, I might be grieving, but I was not yet defeated, and the spirit of Evelyn Hayes, and indeed, of Thomas Hayes, was not so easily extinguished. The final, irrevocable breaking point, the one that propelled me from a state of quiet, despairing endurance to one of cold, determined action, came not with but with a seemingly innocuous domestic incident, an incident that in itself was trivial, but which in the context of everything else became a symbol of their utter contemptuous disregard for me, for my feelings, for my very existence. It was a Tuesday morning, a crisp, clear day in early autumn, the kind of day Thomas and I had always loved, when the air was sharp and clean, and the leaves on the old maple tree by the farmhouse porch were just beginning to turn their glorious shades of red and gold. I had risen early, as was my habit, and had gone out to the small, neglected patch of garden behind the kitchen, the one space they hadn't yet modernized or optimized, to tend to my late blooming asters and chrysanthemums, their vibrant jewel tones, defiant splash of color in an increasingly monochrome world. I had been out there for perhaps an hour, my hands happily caked in rich, dark earth, my mind momentarily at peace, when I heard Mark's voice, raised in anger, coming from the direction of the house. Clara, where in God's name is my blasted briefcase? I'm going to be late for that meeting with the Henderson account. You know how important this is. The Henderson account. Another of Mark's grandiose, and likely ill-fated, schemes to diversify the farm's income, this one involving some complicated and highly speculative investment in artisanal llama cheese. I sighed, a familiar weariness settling over me. Their domestic dramas, their self-inflicted crises, were a constant, unwelcome soundtrack to my days. I continued to deadhead my asters, trying to block out the escalating volume of their argument. Then, I heard Clara's voice, tight with exasperation. I don't know, Mark. Where did you leave it? Have you checked your office? Of course I've checked my office, you idiot, Mark roared. It's not there, and my presentation notes, my laptop, everything's in it. This is a disaster, a complete and utter disaster, and it's all your fault. His fault-finding was, as usual, misplaced and entirely self-serving. Clara, whatever her other failings, was meticulously organized. Mark, on the other hand, was congenitally incapable of remembering where he'd put his own car keys, let alone a vital business briefcase. The argument raged on, their voices growing louder, angrier. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the velvety texture of a deep purple aster, the busy hum of a late-season bee, and then, I heard it, the words that would change everything. Well, maybe if your mother wasn't constantly underfoot, Mark snarled, his voice laced with a venom that chilled me to the bone. If this place wasn't still cluttered up with her useless, sentimental old junk, I might actually be able to find things around here. She's the one who's disorganized. She's the one who's holding us back. You're lucky we even let you stay here, old woman. This is our house now. Our farm. You're just baggage. Baggage. There it was again, the same dismissive, dehumanizing term, but this time, it was not just a careless aside. It was a direct, brutal, public at least, to the audience of one in the garden assault. And Clara said nothing, no word of protest, no defense of her mother, just a silence that was more damning, more hurtful than any angry retort could have been. In that moment, something inside me, something cold and hard and unyielding, snapped into place. I put down my trowel, I wiped my earthy hands on my apron, and I walked, calmly, deliberately, towards the house. I didn't storm in, I didn't shout, I simply appeared in the kitchen doorway. My presence, I could see, an unwelcome, unexpected intrusion into their domestic battlefield. They both stared at me, their faces flushed, their expressions a mixture of guilt and defiance. I believe, I said, my voice quiet, but carrying a new, unfamiliar steely edge, that I just heard my son-in-law refer to me as baggage, and suggest that I am lucky to be allowed to stay in what is, I must remind you both, still, legally, half my home. Am I mistaken? Mark had the grace to look momentarily abashed,
though his eyes still glittered with resentment. Clara, however, merely flushed a deeper shade of red, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Mom," she began, her voice a low, placating murmur. "Mark didn't mean—" "Oh, I think Mark meant exactly what he said, Clara," I interrupted, my voice still quiet, but now imbued with an icy precision. "And frankly, I have had quite enough of being treated as an inconvenience, a burden, a piece of unwanted luggage, in my own home. So since I am clearly holding you back, since my presence here is so awkward, I shall relieve you of it." I paused, letting my words sink in. "I am moving out today." The effect was instantaneous and rather gratifying. Mark's jaw dropped. Clara's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and a dawning panicked understanding. "Move out?" she stammered. "But, Mom, where will you go? You can't just—" "Oh, I assure you, Clara, I can," I said, a small cold smile playing on my lips. "And as for where I will go, that, my dear, is no longer any concern of yours, or yours, Mark." I turned and walked towards my bedroom, the small cramped room they had so magnanimously allowed me to occupy. My suitcase, the faded floral one, was still in the back of the wardrobe. It wouldn't take long to pack. I had so few possessions left that truly mattered to me here. The rest, the house, the farm, the memories, they had already in their own callous way taken from me, or so they thought. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. My name was still on the deed, and my spirit, though battered, was far from broken. The baggage, it seemed, was about to become a rather significant and entirely unexpected encumbrance to their ambitious, streamlined, and suddenly rather precarious future.
The process of packing my few remaining belongings was swift, almost perfunctory. There was so little left that truly felt like mine, so little that hadn't been tainted by their touch, their dismissive disregard. My clothes, a few worn cardigans, sensible skirts, the sturdy walking shoes that had carried me through so many seasons on this farm, my books, my constant companions, their familiar spines, a comforting presence, the small, silver-framed photograph of Thomas, his kind eyes smiling out at me, a silent, steadfast reassurance. And tucked away in a hidden corner of my lingerie drawer, a small, velvet-lined box containing my mother's pearls, a few pieces of my own modest jewelry, and, most importantly, the original deed to the farm, bearing both my name and Thomas's, a document I had, with a foresight I hadn't even realized I possessed at the time, retrieved from the bank's safe deposit box shortly after Thomas's passing. Just in case, just in case. Indeed, as I packed, I could hear their hushed, agitated whispers from the kitchen. They were clearly in a state of shock. Their carefully constructed world, suddenly, inexplicably, tilting on its axis. They had expected tears, perhaps, pleading, a pathetic, elderly capitulation to their will. They had not expected this quiet, calm, and utterly unshakable resolve. When my single suitcase was packed, I walked back into the kitchen. They were standing there, a tableau of bewildered resentment. Clara's face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a dawning, unwelcome guilt. Mark's expression was a mask of thunderous disbelief, his usual arrogant swagger conspicuously absent. "I trust," I said, my voice cool, even, "that you will arrange for the remainder of my useless, sentimental old junk to be disposed of as you see fit. Or perhaps," I added, a small, icy smile touching my lips, "you could sell it to help fund your new, streamlined lifestyle." Mark started to bluster. "Now, see here, Evelyn, you can't just—" "Oh, I believe I can, Mark," I interrupted, my gaze unwavering. "And I am, Clara." I turned to my daughter, my voice softening almost imperceptibly. "I wish you, well, I hope you find the happiness you are so desperately, and it seems, so destructively pursuing." Then, without another word, without a backward glance, I picked up my suitcase and walked out the door, out of the farmhouse that had been my home for nearly half a century, out of the life that had become a prison of disrespect and emotional exploitation, out into the crisp, clear autumn air. A free woman. My first call, from the relative anonymity of a payphone in the nearby village, was to Martha, my oldest, dearest, and most sensible friend. Martha, a retired schoolteacher with a mind as sharp as a tack and a heart as warm as a summer's day, lived in a small, cozy cottage on the other side of the county. She listened to my story, my voice surprisingly steady, as I recounted the events of the morning. Without interruption, her silence punctuated only by an occasional indignant, the unmitigated nerve, or a sympathetic, "Oh, my dear Eleanor." When I had finished, she said simply, "Well, Eleanor, it's about bloody time. Your guest room here is aired. The kettle is on, and there's a rather excellent bottle of sherry breathing on the sideboard. How soon can you get here?" Her unquestioning support, her immediate practical compassion, was a balm to my bruised and battered soul. The bus journey to Martha's cottage was a strange, almost surreal experience. As the familiar Idaho landscape rolled past the window, the golden fields, the distant blue-tinged mountains, the scattered farmhouses nestled in valleys, I felt a profound sense of displacement, of unreality. I was homeless, adrift, a woman of 68, with a single suitcase, and a heart full of a grief so profound it felt like a physical ache. But beneath the grief, beneath the fear, beneath the uncertainty, there was also something else, a small, fragile, but undeniably present flicker of exhilaration. I had done it. I had walked away. I had reclaimed my own agency, my own dignity, and whatever the future held, it would be a future of my own making, not one dictated by the selfish whims of a disrespectful son-in-law and a tragically misguided daughter. Martha greeted me at her garden gate with a fierce, enveloping hug. Her eyes, though filled with sympathy, also held a spark of something that looked remarkably like triumph. "Welcome home, Eleanor," she said, her voice warm, reassuring, "or rather, welcome to your new temporary headquarters. The war room, I believe, is already prepared." The war room, it turned out, was Martha's cozy, chintz-filled living room, where a pot of strong tea, a plate of her famous shortbread, and, true to her word, a bottle of rather excellent sherry, were already waiting. And as we sat there, the late afternoon sun slanting through the window, a plan began to take shape, a plan to reclaim, not just what was legally mine, but what was morally, spiritually, and unequivocally mine, my home, my legacy, my life. The baggage, it seemed, was about to unpack a whole world of trouble for Mark and Clara. Martha, bless her pragmatic and fiercely loyal heart, was not one for half measures or sentimental hand-wringing. While I was still reeling from the emotional shock of my precipitate departure, she was already in full strategic mode. "Right, Eleanor," she said, after I'd recounted the full sordid tale, her voice brisk, businesslike. "First things first, we need a lawyer, a good one, someone who eats arrogant, entitled young men like your Mark for breakfast, and doesn't mind spitting out the pips." I must have looked rather alarmed at this colorful, if somewhat aggressive metaphor, because she patted my hand reassuringly. "Don't worry, dear, I know just the woman. Miss Agnes Finch, a bit of a dragon, some say, but a dragon you definitely want on your side. She handled my cousin Millie's rather messy divorce from that dreadful stockbroker, and let me tell you, Millie came out of it smelling of roses and rather a lot of his offshore ass." The thought of engaging lawyers, of entering into a legal battle with my own daughter and her husband, was daunting, but Martha, with her unwavering conviction and her infectious optimism, was a formidable force. She brooked no argument, dismissed my hesitant protestations about the cost, the unpleasantness, the potential for further family schism. "Nonsense, Eleanor," she declared. "This isn't about unpleasantness, it's about just. And as for family schism, my dear, I think that particular ship has already sailed, hit an iceberg, and sunk without a trace, largely thanks to the navigational ineptitude of Captain Mark and First Mate Clara. Now drink your sherry, and let me make that call." Miss Agnes Finch, when we met her a few days later in her discreet, reassuringly expensive-looking office in Boise, was indeed, as Martha had predicted, something of a dragon, tall, impeccably dressed, with eyes that seemed to see right through to the very marrow of one's soul. She listened to my story with an unnerving, almost clinical intensity. She asked sharp, pertinent questions, her inquiries probing, relentless, leaving no stone unturned. I showed her the deed to the farm, my name, Evelyn Hayes, clearly, unequivocally, stated as co-owner with my late husband, Thomas Hayes, and subsequently by inheritance, with my daughter Clara Hayes Miller. I recounted Mark's casual dismissal of my ownership, his arrogant assumption of control, the systematic erosion of my rights, my dignity. I even, with a reluctance that surprised myself, told her about the baggage comment, the final unbearable insult that had precipitated my departure. Miss Finch's expression remained impassive throughout, but I saw a flicker of something, controlled outrage, professional indignation, in her cool gray eyes. When I had finished, she was silent for a long moment, her gaze thoughtful. Miss Hayes, she said finally, her voice calm but firm, what your son-in-law and I regret to say, your daughter have done is not just morally reprehensible, it is in several key aspects, legally actionable. The co-ownership of the farm gives you specific rights, rights they have clearly, and systematically, violated. Their attempts to dispossess you, to deny you access to your own property, their potential misuse of farm assets, and your personal finances, these are all serious matters. A wave of relief, so profound it almost buckled my knees, washed over me. To hear my suspicions, my pain, validated by a legal professional, to know that I wasn't just an embittered old woman imagining slights, but a victim of genuine wrongdoing. It was a powerful affirmation. What can we do? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Miss Finch outlined a plan of action. First, an immediate formal notification to Mark and Clara, asserting my legal rights as co-owner, demanding full access to the property, and all financial records pertaining to the farm's operation. Second, a thorough forensic accounting of the farm's finances, and indeed, of my own personal accounts, to which they had had access. Third, depending on the findings, legal proceedings to recover any misappropriated funds, and most importantly, to force a partition sale of the farm. A partition sale, Mrs. Hayes, she explained, is a legal remedy when co-owners cannot agree on the management or disposition of a shared property. The court can order the property to be sold, and the proceeds divided according to the respective shares of ownership. In your case, given their egregious behavior, and their clear intention to dispossess you, it is, I believe, our strongest and most effective course of action. Sell the farm, my farm, Thomas's farm. The thought was a fresh wave of grief, a final painful severance, but it also felt necessary. The farm, under Mark and Clara's stewardship, had become a place of bitterness, of betrayal. Its memories, once so precious, were now tainted by their greed, their disrespect. Perhaps a clean break was the only way forward. I understand, Finch, I said, my voice firmer than I felt. If that is what it takes to reclaim what is rightfully mine, to ensure they do not profit from their cruelty, then so be it. Miss Finch nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. Very good, Mrs. Hay. That is the spirit. Now let us begin. I believe your son-in-law and your daughter are in for a rather educational experience. The legal machinery, once set in motion, moved with a surprising and rather gratifying speed. The formal notification, delivered by registered post to the farm, landed, I imagine, with the explosive impact of a well-aimed grenade. Martha, who still had a few discreet sources in our old neighborhood, reported that the atmosphere at the Hayes Miller household, as Mark now grandly referred to it, was one of apoplectic rage and ill-concealed panic. There were apparently raised voices, slammed doors, and a hasty, late-night consultation with their own presumably rather expensive legal counsel. Their response when it finally came, via a letter from a slick, city-based law firm, was a masterpiece of blustering indignation and legal obfuscation. They denied all wrongdoing, accused me of senile vindictiveness and malicious interference in their legitimate business operations, and threatened dire, unspecified, legal consequences
if I pursued my frivolous and vexatious claims. Miss Finch, upon reading their response, merely chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Standard tactics, Mrs. Hayes. They're trying to bully you into submission. It won't work. We have the facts, the law, and if I may say so, the moral high ground, firmly on our side. Let them bluster. We shall proceed. And proceed we did. The fight for my farm, for my dignity, for my very soul, had truly begun. The months that followed were a grueling education in the often frustrating, invariably expensive, and emotionally draining realities of legal warfare. Mark and Clara, through their increasingly aggressive legal team, fought us every step of the way. They filed counter motions, challenged every document, questioned every assertion. They attempted to paint me as a confused, embittered old woman, incapable of managing my own affairs, easily manipulated by opportunistic third parties, a clear if unspoken reference to Martha and Miss Finch. It was a deeply unpleasant, often humiliating experience. There were depositions where I was forced to recount, under oath, the painful details of their betrayal, their disrespect, their casual cruelty. Their lawyer, a man whose smarmy demeanor and insinuating questions made my skin crawl, tried to twist my words, to pick apart my memories, to make me doubt my own sanity. But with Miss Finch by my side, her calm, incisive intellect, a constant shield, her unwavering belief in the justice of my cause, a steadying anchor, I held firm. I spoke my truth, simply, clearly, without embellishment, without rank. The forensic accounting of the farm's finances, and of my own personal accounts, was a painstaking, meticulous process. It laid bare, in cold, hard, undeniable figures, the extent of their financial mismanagement, and indeed, their outright fraud. Mark's innovative farming schemes had all been disastrously expensive failures, financed not by his own non-existent capital, but by loans taken out against the farm's assets, and by the systematic draining of my own savings. Clara's lifestyle, expenditures, expensive spa days, lavish renovations to my farmhouse kitchen, were all meticulously documented, all charged, directly or indirectly, to accounts that were either jointly owned, or to which they had gained access through deceit and manipulation. The evidence was damning, irrefutable. Even their own legal team, I sensed, was beginning to realize the untenability of their position. Their bluster began to fade, replaced by a sullen, resentful defensiveness. Clara, during one particularly grueling deposition, actually broke down in tears, not, I suspected, from remorse, but from the sheer, unadulterated stress of having her carefully constructed facade of entitlement and effortless superiority so publicly, so comprehensively dismantled. I felt a flicker of something then, a pang of residual maternal pity, quickly suppressed. She had made her bed, now she was being forced to lie in it. The court, after what felt like an eternity of legal wrangling, finally ruled in my favor. The evidence of financial malfeasance, of breach of trust, of undue influence, was overwhelming. A partition sale of the farm was ordered. The proceeds, after all outstanding legitimate debts were settled, were to be divided equally between myself and Clara, my half finally, unequivocally, mine to command. Mark and Clara were given 90 days to vacate the premises. The victory, when it came, was not jubilant. There was no triumphant fist-pumping, no whoops of elation, just a quiet, profound sense of relief, of justice, however belated, however hard-won, finally, painstakingly, achieved. The farm, my beloved farm, would be sold. The thought was still a wrench, a deep, aching sadness, but it was a necessary sadness, a letting go that was essential for my own healing, my own peace. It was tainted now, its memories overlaid with the ugliness of their betrayal. It was time for a new chapter, a new beginning, for me, and for the land itself. Martha, when I told her the news, enveloped me in one of her fierce, bone-crushing hugs. "Well done, Eleanor," she boomed, her eyes suspiciously bright. "You fought the good fight, my dear, and you won. Now what about a celebratory share? Or perhaps," she added, a mischievous twinkle in her eye, "something a little stronger. I believe this calls for schnapps." We settled for sherry, and a long, comfortable evening of quiet conversation, of shared relief, of tentative, hopeful, plans for the future. A future that was, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, entirely, unequivocally, my own. The baggage had finally, blessedly, been unpacked, and its contents, I was beginning to realize, were far more valuable, far more resilient, than anyone, least of all myself, had ever imagined. The sale of the farm was a surprisingly swift and straightforward affair. Miss Finch, with her customary efficiency, engaged a reputable rural property agent, and within a few weeks, a suitable buyer had been found, a young idealistic couple from the city, eager to escape the urban rat race, and embrace a simpler, more sustainable way of life. They reminded me, in a poignant, bittersweet way of Thomas and myself, all those years ago, armed with little more than dreams, and a boundless, youthful optimism. They spoke of organic farming, of restoring the old apple orchard Thomas had planted, of raising their children with a connection to the land, to the seasons. I met them once, briefly, at Miss Finch's office. They seemed kind, genuine, their enthusiasm infectious. I felt a quiet sense of peace, of rightness, in knowing that the farm, my farm, would be in good hands, that it would be loved again, cherished, not exploited. The division of the proceeds, after all debts and legal fees were settled, left me with a comfortable if not extravagant sum, enough to secure a modest, but independent future, enough to finally, blessedly, breathe free. Mark and Clara's departure from the farm, according to Martha's ever-reliable sources, was a far less dignified affair. They left under a cloud of resentment, their dreams of rural gentrification, of effortless agrarian success, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Their modernizations had proven to be costly follies, their financial mismanagement catastrophic. They were, I heard, facing a mountain of personal debt, their once glossy lifestyle, now a distant, mocking memory. Clara, apparently, had been forced to take a job as a receptionist in a dental practice in Boise. Mark, his grand entrepreneurial schemes, having all imploded, was rumored to be selling used cars, his smooth salesman's patter, now employed in a far less glamorous, and considerably less lucrative, arena.
I felt no triumph in their downfall, only a distant, weary sadness. They were the architects of their own misfortune. Yes, but Clara was still my daughter, and to see her brought so low, her youthful arrogance replaced by a bitter, resentful disillusionment, was a pain that lingered, a dull ache in the background of my newfound peace. With Martha's enthusiastic, if somewhat overwhelming, assistance, I found a small, sunny cottage in a quiet retirement village on the outskirts of a charming little town, nestled in the foothills, a good 3-hour drive from the farm, and, more importantly, from any lingering association with Mark and Clara. My new home was modest, but it was mine. It had a small, manageable garden, already planted with a few sturdy rose bushes, and a promising patch of lavender. It had a bright, airy living room, perfect for my books and my watercolors, a hobby I had, with Martha's encouragement, tentatively begun to explore. And it had a small, sun-drenched porch, where I could sit with a cup of tea and watch the world go by, at my own pace, on my own terms. Moving in was a surprisingly joyful experience. There were so few physical possessions I had salvaged from my old life: Thomas's photograph, my mother's pearls, a few treasured books, the faded floral suitcase that had become such a potent symbol of my dispossession, and now, paradoxically, of my liberation. But as I arranged these small, precious talismans in my new surroundings, a sense of peace, of rightness, of homecoming, settled over me. This was my space now, my sanctuary, untainted by betrayal, unmarred by disrespect, a blank canvas upon which to paint the final, quiet, and hopefully, contented chapter of my life. My days settled into a new, gentle rhythm: morning walks in the nearby hills, the air crisp and clean, the views breathtaking; afternoons spent in my small garden, my hands happily caked in rich, dark earth, coaxing life from the soil, much as Thomas and I had done, all those years ago. Evenings often spent with Martha, who had, with characteristic aplomb, decided that my new village was so charming, she might just consider relocating there herself one day. We'd share a simple meal, a glass of surprisingly good local wine, and endless, meandering conversations about everything and nothing. I reconnected with old friends, women I hadn't seen in years, whose companionship I had sorely missed. I joined a local book club, a quilting circle, even, to Martha's undisguised amusement, a rather sedate line dancing class at the community center. My life, once so circumscribed, so constrained by the demands and expectations of others, was now, suddenly, blessedly, my own. The baggage had not just been unpacked, it had been transformed into a quiet strength, a resilient spirit, a hard-won, and deeply cherished, independent. And as I sat on my sunny little porch, a contented sigh escaping my lips, the scent of lavender and roses heavy in the air, I knew, with an unshakable certainty, that Evelyn Hayes, the old woman, the discarded luggage, had finally, truly, come home. The epilogue to my story, the final, quiet cadence after the storm, was one of gentle healing and unexpected grace. Life in my sunny little cottage, in the foothills, became a tapestry, woven from small, everyday joys, the unfolding of a new rosebud in my garden, the discovery of a forgotten author in the village library, the shared laughter, with Martha, over a particularly disastrous attempt at baking a souffle, the sharp edges of the betrayal, the raw wound of Clara, and Mark's cruelty, began to soften, to fade, their power to inflict pain, diminishing with each passing season of peace. I did not forget, of course. Such scars remain, a testament to battles fought, to lessons learned, but I no longer dwelled in the bitterness of the past. My focus was on the present, on cultivating a life of quiet contentment, of simple, unpretentious beauty. One crisp autumn afternoon, about 2 years after I had settled into my new life, a letter arrived. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, the postmark from a small, obscure town in a neighboring state. My heart did a strange, complicated flip. I opened it with a certain trepidation. It was from Clara. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness, not an attempt to excuse her past behavior. It was different, shorter, more subdued than I might have expected. She wrote that she and Mark had divorced. He had, apparently, moved on to greener, and presumably more lucrative, pastures, leaving her to pick up the pieces of their shattered ambitions and their considerable debts. She was working, she wrote, as a waitress, in a small town diner, living in a cramped, rented room, above a noisy bar. Her life, the one she had once envisioned as a glittering testament to her sophisticated taste and effortless success, had been reduced to a daily struggle for survival, for a modicum of dignity. There was no self-pity in her words, no attempt to elicit my sympathy or my financial assistance, only a stark, unvarnished, and deeply weary recitation of the facts. She ended the letter with a single, almost hesitant question. Are you well, Mom? I read the letter several times, a complex mixture of emotions swirling within me. There was no triumph, no sense of vindication, only a profound, aching sadness for her, for the bright, promising young woman she had once been, now so lost, so broken, by her own choices, her own destructive ambition, for the daughter I had loved, and despite everything, still loved, in that deep, indelible, and often inexplicable way that mothers do. I didn't reply immediately. I needed time to process, to understand my own heart. What did I feel? Anger, resentment, pity? Yes, all of those, in varying degrees. But beneath it all, there was also something else, a faint, flickering ember of compassion, not for the arrogant, entitled woman who had so callously discarded me, but for the lost, struggling human being who was now, perhaps finally, beginning to confront the true cost of her choices. A week later, I wrote back, a short, simple note. Yes, Clara, I am well, I hope. One day, you will be too. I enclosed no money, offered no solutions, made no promise, just a quiet acknowledgement of her existence. A small, almost imperceptible, opening of a door that had long been bolted shut. Whether she would ever choose to walk through it, whether our fractured relationship could ever truly be mended, I did not know. That part of the story was hers to write. My story, however, had found its own quiet, satisfying resolution. I had reclaimed my home, my dignity, my peace. I had learned that true wealth lies not in possessions, but in self-respect, in friendship, in the simple, enduring beauty of a life lived with integrity. The baggage had not just been unpacked, it had been transformed. It had become a testament to resilience, to strength, to the quiet, indomitable power of an old woman who had, against all odds, refused to be erased. And that, I knew, was a legacy, far richer, far more enduring, than any farm, any inheritance, could ever be. My days continued, peaceful, contented, filled with the gentle rhythms of my garden, my books, my friendship. And as I sat on my sunny little porch, the scent of lavender and roses, a constant, comforting fragrance, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that Evelyn Hayes, the old woman, the discarded luggage, had finally, truly, and gloriously come home to herself.